As a guy who grew up in Beaver County, I'm extremely excited that Chris and Shannon are here. You know, I have been dreaming about this day that Northway might be going to Beaver Valley, and finally we are going to that area. And so if you want some more information about our Beaver Valley campus and maybe being a part of the launch team, maybe being a part of, just praying for that campus, then you can go to our website, which is northway.org/Beaver Valley. And so did you guys notice this, that Chris White has the same last name as our worship pastor, Billy Bob White, and they both have this accent going on? That's because Chris is actually Billy Bob's bigger brother. And so we're really glad that he is here. We can celebrate that. God's been sending us, at all of our campuses, right? So we can celebrate that. God's been sending us great people to be a part of this team. So if you want some more information about that, let me just tell you that across all of our campuses, we are going to have a major push for the core team in late August. So don't worry, you won't miss it. You will see it at all of our campuses, that you will not be able to miss that when you can join the core team, okay? So today, we are in the second part of our series entitled Shipwrecked. And Pastor Scott, he kicked us off last week by teaching us how many of us have been taught to grieve growing up, versus how God has actually given us a process to grieve. And he reminded us last week that grief is not about things like, the Pirates losing in 1992 to the Atlanta Braves when Sid Bream came in sliding in at home and launched us into a 20-year losing streak. That is not grief. That's not what we're talking about in this series. Or if you're me, it's not the feelings that I had during the AFC 2011 wild card game when the Steelers were playing against the Denver Broncos. We should have never, ever been tied, 23-23, but we were headed into overtime, and look what happened.
First, that would be the Denver Broncos. Tails did fail for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Tim Tebow gets his first chance. First pass, first play of the new overtime.
Oh, man.
Tebow. Demarius touchdown. Wraps it up. One and done. John Owen can't believe it.
It still hurts. It still hurts. He's up there Tebowing. And I cannot stand the Denver Broncos, but I've brought myself to forgive Tim Tebow because he's a brother in Christ, right? But I still hate the Broncos. Let's just be clear about that. I'm still grieving that loss since 2011. See, that's not grief. That's not what we're talking about in this series. Grief is much deeper than that. As we all are going to experience or have experienced loss, change, divorce, crisis, death. See, grief is something that if it hasn't already touched your life, it will touch your life. Grief is universal, but it's also this individual experience. And each experience of grief is as unique as the person who's going to walk through it. So each person is going to process through grief very differently, because grief indeed is a process. It's not some sort of formula. A plus B equals C and then you're good. That's not how it works. But even though grief is a process, there is a decision that we all face when we walk through the stages of grief. And here's the decision that we can make. The big question that we're answering today is this: what is going to be our response to grief? Are we going to face it, or are we going to run away from it? To use our shipwreck imagery here, are we going to swim through the waves of grief that come crashing over us, or are we going to let them take us under? And I realize something, that even though we don't feel like we have a choice when we're in grief, I want to show us that we do. We do have a choice to make. Because here's my goal for today. I want to lay my cards out onto the table, so to speak, to let you know that grief in your life will be processed. It will. It's not a question of if it will. It's a matter of a question of, will it be processed in a healthy way or in a harmful way? And so last week, Pastor Scott introduced us to Sue Dawson, one of the founding members of Northway Christian Community, some 36 years ago. And she was brave enough to share with us her story about her husband collapsing in the park, life-flighted, without oxygen to his brain for some 15 minutes. And she shared with us the horrific moments and the pain of the hospital and eventually leading to his death. And now today I want to show you the continuation of her story and her response to this horrible tragedy. Take a look.
The next few days were terrible. It was very hard, but it's something that everyone who loses someone goes through, and you just live through it. We had the memorial service and the 2 days at the church where it was actually a great blessing to go through that closure that people talk about. So many people showed up. I was completely overwhelmed. After the memorial service, we went to the cemetery, and I realized how powerful grief is when it even affected my body so physically. I got out of the car with my parents, who were fortunately on either side, and my knees buckled. I couldn't believe my knees actually buckled. That's how powerful grief is. In the beginning, I just cried all the time. All the time. Whenever I was alone, in the shower, walking down the street, going to bed, I think every night for 2 years. And then eventually I got used to the idea, and I could cope with it. But it's not over. It comes in waves. That's the way grief is. I love Jay just as much today as I did then. It just comes in waves. After that, I went home, and I didn't want to be alone. Fortunately, my parents were there. And I was so very blessed to have friends coming in to help me, family members. I couldn't have done it without all of them. And my parents gave me a card. It said, 1 day at a time, 1 step at a time. And I still have it on Jay's legal desk up in our bedroom. That's the way I've gone on, 1 day at a time, 1 step at a time.
I again just want to thank Sue for being brave enough to share her story. Next week, we're going to conclude her story in the third part of this series. So I want to come back to Sue's story in just a second, but before I do, I want to introduce you to something, or maybe remind you of something that maybe you learned in high school. Many of you are aware of the 5 stages of grief from a woman by the name of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She was a Swiss-American psychiatrist, and she was a pioneer in near-death studies. And she was the author of a groundbreaking book on death and dying, where she first discussed her theory about the 5 stages of grief. And so in her research, she came to this understanding that every person in this world would go through these 5 stages of grief, but not only about death and dying, but also in grief in general. And so I just want to give us a very high overview of these 5 stages of grief. The first one is this: denial. And this is where the reality of the tragedy or the loss just hasn't quite hit us yet. And then she says the second, bargaining. And this is where you try to negotiate or compromise. Maybe you've said in the past, God, I promise that if you'll get me out of this, or if you bring them back, then I'll do this. And then she says we move into anger. And this, she explains, is a cover-up emotion for what's really going on underneath the surface of our lives. This is where we try to find somebody to blame, or we try to take revenge on what is happening. And then she says we move into depression. And this can range from sadness to regret to fear to uncertainty. And this is where you're beginning to allow yourself to just be raw and feel it, to feel those emotions, feel the pain. And then she says that we move into acceptance. And this is where she explains, this is the point of knowing that it is what it is. And you accept what has happened. It doesn't make the tragedy or the loss feel any better. It's just that you know that, okay, I need to go on. And in her research, she not only applied this to death and dying, but to all grief that we all are going to walk through. And our worship pastor, Billy Bob White, his wife, Colette, is a licensed professional counselor. And she wrote an article recently on change and loss, to which she, in that article, referred to these 5 stages of grief. And I want you to see what she wrote, especially the first line and especially the last line of what I'm about to quote you. So look at what she wrote. She says this: "Please do not confuse grieving with a lack of faith." That's huge. See, it's a part of being human. You cannot skip over it. You cannot avoid it by just thinking positively and keeping your chin up. After all, in the Bible, 1/3 of the Psalms are grieving Psalms. Then there's the book of Lamentations, dedicated completely to grieving. And then this is huge as well. Also understand that you can cycle through all 5 of these stages at any point, at any time, and repeat them several times over. And then listen to this last line. Just keep moving through. See, both of these godly women, Sue and Colette, are saying something extremely similar about walking through these 5 stages of grief. Sue said it like this: one day at a time, one step at a time. And Colette said, just keep moving through. And friends, I want to submit to you today that this is the healthy response to grief. To face it, to wade through the tough waters of grief. You know, the prophet Rocky Balboa, in Rocky 6, he gave his son some incredible wisdom when he said this: it ain't about how hard you hit, it's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward. And we move forward through grief one step at a time, one day at a time. And I promise you this, it's going to be painful. But you and I will be better off in the long run if we face it head on, instead of forcing it down. Like we learned last week, we were taught to force it down, to shove it down, to suppress our grief. But here's the deal. No matter how hard you try to do that, your grief will keep coming up to the surface. There's a reason why God keeps bringing your shipwreck of grief up to the surface. There's a reason why you keep yelling at people in traffic who can't even hear you. There's a reason why you keep popping off on your kids over simple things like spilled milk. There's a reason. God's bringing it up. Because here's the thing, if you don't take the time to process your grief in a healthy way, your grief will make the time to come out in a very unhealthy way. A woman came up to me after the service last week, and she was with her friends and her mom. And she told me that sadly her husband had just recently died, leaving her a single mom of 3 precious kids, leaving her working full-time, responsibilities around the house, the kids' activities, and I cannot even imagine what she is walking through each and every day as she faces her grief. But as we were talking, she said something to me that I believe is a lie, that many of us have bought into. And here's what she said to me, and see if you can relate to this in your grief. Here's what she said to me: I don't have time to grieve him. And as we talked about that a little bit, there was something that as we were talking that I felt like the Lord dropped into my heart in that moment to share with her. And so if you can relate to that at all, then I want to share this with you. If you don't stop to grieve, then your grief will eventually stop you. If you don't stop to grieve, your grief will eventually stop you. If you and I don't take the time to intentionally grieve what has happened or what is happening, then we're eventually going to shut down emotionally, physically, spiritually. And then we're going to begin to operate out of a very hardened heart and a wounded spirit. And nobody wants that. I mean, you didn't wake up this morning hoping that you would be miserable. Nobody did. Nobody wants, in the morning, I hope I can make other people's lives miserable. I hope I can make my kid feel like they're not loved because of what I just said to them. Nobody wants that. But these are the kind of things that can happen if we don't take the time to process our grief in a healthy way. So I want to show you something of how we can do this. We need a model for how we can move through our grief. And so I want to show you Jesus and what he did in his grief. See, you might not know this about Jesus, but he was very acquainted with grief and suffering and loss and pain. Even if you're here and you don't believe in Jesus, just follow a guy who was a great model of how to work through grief. It was said of him that he was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. See, Jesus is a guy worth following into grief and how to handle it. Jesus, at several points in his life, was dealing with overwhelming loss and tragedy. We learned last week that his good friend Lazarus died, and he grieved over that loss. Think about it. Jesus would have grieved the death of his dad, Joseph. Jesus would have grieved the death, the murder of his cousin, John. We know him as John the Baptist. Did you know that Jesus was abused? Did you know that he was humiliated in front of crowds of people? Check this out. Jesus was abandoned by those who were closest to him. In fact, one of his committed disciples turned on him in the last week of his life, and he handed him over to be killed. Jesus is very acquainted with grief and suffering and loss and pain. So I want to quickly point out 2 different times where Jesus shows us how we can move through our grief. See, we're not just talking about death and crisis and tragedy, divorce. We're not just talking about those things in this series. How many of you have ever grieved in your life a missed opportunity? Where you realize that you made a decision to go this way with your life, but it took you in a direction that completely, messed up where you really wanted to go. See, Jesus knows what that feels like. Because his mission in this life was to introduce broken and hurting and searching people into a healing relationship with God the Father. But take a look at what Dr. Luke writes about Jesus. Look at this. But as Jesus came closer to Jerusalem and he saw the city ahead, Jesus began to weep. And now this is Jesus speaking. How I wish today that all of you people would understand the way to peace, but now it's too late and peace is hidden from your eyes. Jesus stopped before he entered into the city of Jerusalem to grieve the missed opportunity of people, to embrace the fact that the Son of the living God was in their midst and they missed him completely. They didn't see him. And Jesus wept for an entire city of the people who missed salvation. And did you notice what he did? He didn't suppress down those feelings. He let it out. Jesus wept. And if you read this account in the original text, this is a powerful, raw moment where Jesus intentionally stopped to weep and to let it out, to let other people into his grief and to model for those people of how to grieve. And so, in the original text here, you got to understand this. This wasn't a little cry. This was one of those face-distorting, snot-dripping, body-convulsing, I feel like I'm going to throw up kind of cries. And he did it on purpose. He stopped to do it. See, we've been taught, we learned this last week, we've been taught to stuff down our grief, to bury our feelings, especially dudes. right? We've been taught as men to not, from our uncles, from our dads, from things like movies and TV, guys like Clint Eastwood, that real men don't cry, right? That tough guys, we don't show our emotion. Well, I beg to differ, which is no surprise to many of you who've been around here at Northway for a while. You know me as the crying pastor, right? But that's beside the point. Here's the point. I beg to differ because you cannot get more manly than Jesus, who after weeping in that moment set his face towards Jerusalem and he went to endure the cross on purpose. You can't get more manly than that. You cannot get more manly than the guy who took the nails in his hands and his feet for you. You cannot get more manly than the guy who predicted his death and his resurrection, and he actually pulled it off. You can't get more manly than that. See, guys, listen, tough does not mean that you don't weep. Tough means that you stop to weep and then you move forward in love. That's tough. And that's what Jesus did for us. So just keep moving through, right? That's what the lady said, one day at a time, one step at a time. And we can follow Jesus in the way that he taught us to grieve, to stop to grieve so that we can move forward. So I want to give you permission today. Stop pretending. Stop pretending that it doesn't hurt like hell itself has come to take you under. You're hurting. It's okay to say that you're not okay. Tell the people who love you that you're hurting. Don't keep them guessing and wondering how you're feeling. Tell the God who loves you that you're hurting. That's what Jesus did here. He let people in on it. He was telling God, his Father, that he was hurting. It's going to be 10 years ago, this September 24th, that Erica's dad died from a rare blood cancer. I can't believe it's been that long. And no matter how you try to slice it or spiritualize it, it sucks that he's gone way too early. And I have watched in my wife's life how the waves of grief just keep coming. And you know what the best thing that she has learned is to not force it down, to not talk about it. She's actually learned to celebrate his name, to say his name out loud, to share memories with our kids. She's learned that it's okay to say that she's having a bad day because she saw a dad and his daughter walking through the mall. It's okay to say you're not okay. See, she is practicing. She constantly has to practice because they keep coming, these waves of grief. She keeps practicing to feel her feelings, to actually review the loss and what happened with her dad. And it's okay to do those kind of things, right? She allows others into that. She's grieving in community. And she's allowing the Holy Spirit to just continue to show her that she's gonna be okay and that she's gonna love again. God has been teaching her over the 10 years that it's gonna be okay and that she's gonna learn to trust him again. And so I want to encourage you here today. If you have never, ever stopped to grieve, then you need to do that. You need to seriously schedule some time to stop and to just grieve what's going on. Take a sick day because your heart is sick and needs some healing. Do whatever you need to do to be able to grieve the situation that's going on. Something life-changing has happened, and you need to be uncomfortable in it and allow other people to be uncomfortable with you in it. Do whatever you need to do. You need to schedule some time to have a scream session, then scream. Do whatever you need to do. Schedule some time to just cry. But if you don't stop to intentionally grieve, then you're going to feel these things come up at the most inopportune time. See, friends, I want to show you what happens here when we actually take the time to stop and grieve. See, God says this is a promise to those of you who are hurting right now. Look at this. God draws close to the brokenhearted, and he saves the crushed in spirit. Some of you, you are so mad at God right now, you need to just tell him. Tell him that you're upset with him. See, he's not afraid of those kind of raw feelings. So tell him what's on your heart and your mind. See, he's not afraid of the question. Some of you just need to ask the question, be vulnerable enough to take those broken pieces to God and say, why? How could you allow this? And I want to tell you, God's not afraid of that question. But here's the thing, you need to stop long enough to hear his response. Some of you right now, you need to let other people into your lives, and you know that you're keeping people at a distance. Because the second thing that I want to point out that Jesus did was something that we need to pay attention to. When he went to the Garden of Gethsemane, and it's recorded in the Gospels, and we're going to take a look at Matthew 26, his particular account of this. Jesus stopped, and he actually, please listen, he actually stopped and led people into his depression. Did you realize that Jesus was depressed? And he led people into his pain and into his suffering. Take a look at Matthew 26. Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And then taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, that's James and John, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Can any of you relate with that? And then he said, remain here, stay with me, and watch with me. See, one of the best things that we can do, friends, to move forward through our grief is to tell another person just how bad we're really hurting, and to let them in to the deepest pain. To be honest with them about how this grief is crushing us. And friends, this is not easy, but it is the best response to grief. Remember what Colette and Sue said. Just keep moving through, one day at a time, one step at a time. Last week, at the end of our service, Scott gave us some time to practice this biblical response to grieving. And this is a process that he outlined for us where many of you, at the end of that service, you had an experience because we gave you some time to stop and grieve. And many of you, you gave yourself permission, maybe for the first time, to actually feel your feelings. And many of you, you reviewed your loss. Do you remember this process? And you grieved in community, and others prayed over you in that moment. And many of you, you've told us that you allowed the Holy Spirit to begin or to continue that healing process. And many of you felt God's presence in that moment. And you felt him and the hope that he can provide to you. And you were able to sort of come out of here confident, knowing that at one point you're going to be able to love again. You're going to be able to move forward. And how do I know this is because you talked with our elders and their wives after the service. You sent in emails and you phone calls, and you told us about your divorce. You told us about the death of your child. You told us about the loss of your job. You told us about the letter of resignation, and so on. So many stories we've heard from you. And so today I want to give you some more time, because here's what I know, that many of you are still hurting. See, just because you faced it in one service doesn't mean that the grief is going to vanish. It's still there. The waves keep coming. And so I want to give you some more time today to stop and move through your grief, no matter how large or small it is. And I want to help you face your grief today with a glimmer of hope. So just before we're done, and I'm going to give you some time to stop in just a second, I want to show you something that's going to help you, that can give you hope today. As you continue to follow Jesus and his journey to the cross, things got much worse for him before they got better. And that doesn't sound like it's going to be helpful or hopeful, but it is. That perspective can help you tremendously. And I want to make sure that before you stop to grieve today, that you can do it understanding what Jesus did for us. When he went to the cross for us, what happened for us? Because we have a model for Jesus who went through the worst pain possible. And because he did, look at what happened for us. Look at this, Isaiah 53, he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. And by his wounds we, what's that next word? Are healed. We are healed. Because of the death of Jesus on the cross and his resurrection from the grave, we too can have hope that we're going to be okay. Just like Jesus. See, God took the worst, most painful, horrific tragedy and he pulled off the greatest healing of all time. And he can do the same thing for you today. God can heal your heart. God can heal your soul, your mind, your physical body. God can heal you. Just keep moving through and towards him to your grief. And so friends, right now, as a safe community, at all of our locations, I want us to intentionally stop right now to move through our grief together. I want you to bring your weakness to God right now and let him be strong for you. I want you to tell God what you need right now in this moment. Go ahead, come to him, right? But then I want you to stop long enough so that you can hear his voice. And you know what he's going to say to you right now? Even though you don't feel like it, you're going to be okay. You're going to get through it. So everybody, let's just take some time to stop and let these words wash over us. Take a look.